The rifle leveled at her belly stopped Ruth Brennan cold. "That child don't belong here," her brother said, his voice flat as the Texas plane behind him. "And neither do you." She stood in the doorway of the house where she'd been born, her hands protective over the swell beneath her dress, and understood that blood meant nothing when shame came calling. But that was 3 days ago. 3 weeks earlier, the letter had arrived. Ruth sat at the kitchen table of her family's ranch house outside Abilene, turning the envelope over in her hands. The postmark read San Antonio. The handwriting belonged to Lieutenant Thomas Webb, the cavalry officer she'd met last spring when his unit passed through town. Her younger sister Mary watched from the stove. "What's he say?" Ruth's hands trembled as she read. Then read again. Thomas had been reassigned to Fort Davis. The distance made marriage impractical. He wished her well. That was all. No mention of the promises made beneath the cottonwood trees. No acknowledgement of the nights she'd believed his whispered words about waiting, about coming back, about building a life together. Mary's face went pale. "Ruth, please tell me you didn't." "I thought he meant it," Ruth whispered. "He said he loved me." Her sister crossed herself. "Papa will kill you." She wasn't wrong. Ruth's father had built his ranch through 30 years of hard weather and harder men. He valued 2 things, reputation and control. A daughter with child and no husband destroyed both. When Ruth told him that evening, he didn't shout. That would have been kinder. He simply looked at her across the dinner table and said, "You have 2 days to marry or leave." "Thomas won't answer my letters," she said quietly. He made his choice clear. Her father's jaw tightened. "Then you've made yours." Her mother said nothing, just stared at her plate. Ruth spent those 2 days writing desperate letters to Thomas, to his commanding officer, to anyone who might help. No response came. On the 3rd morning, her brother Jacob met her at the door, rifle in hand. "Papa says you go now," he said. Not cruel, just matter of fact. Following orders like the good son he was. Their mother pressed $20 into Ruth's hand and wouldn't meet her eyes. Ruth walked down the road with one carpetbag and the clothes on her back. She was 28 years old. She'd helped birth calves and mend fences and run that ranch as well as any man. None of it mattered now. She caught the afternoon stage to nowhere in particular. The driver let her off at a crossroads 30 miles west, where the land turned rough and the homesteads grew sparse. She'd asked for the first place that wasn't Abilene. This was it. The sun hammered down. Her belly felt heavy as stone. She started walking, though she had no destination, just the dim hope of finding a town, a church, somewhere that might offer charity to a woman in her condition. She made it 2 miles before the world tilted. Her vision grayed at the edges. The heat pressed against her skull. She stumbled off the road into the shadow of a mesquite tree and sank down, her back against the truck. Just for a moment, she told herself. Just to catch her breath. The darkness took her anyway. When consciousness returned, it came with the sound of hoofbeats and a man's voice, low and cautious. "Ma'am, you hurt." She opened her eyes to find a weathered face studying her, angular and sundark, maybe 40, with gray threading through black hair. He knelt a respectful distance away, hat in his hands. Ruth tried to sit up. The world spun again. "Easy." He moved closer, steadying her with one hand on her shoulder. His grip was firm but careful. "You been out here long?" "I don't know." Her throat felt like sand. He reached for a canteen on his belt and offered it. She drank gratefully. "I'm Daniel Ashford," he said. "Got a ranch about a mile north. You got people nearby?" The question landed like a blow. Ruth looked down at her hands, at the dust on her dress, at the truth she couldn't hide. "No," she said, quietly. "Not anymore." His gaze dropped to her belly, then quickly away. No judgment in his expression, just careful assessment. "You need a doctor," he said. "I need employment," Ruth replied. "I can work. I'm strong. I know livestock. I can, ma'am." His tone was gentle but firm. "Right now you need water and shade. We'll figure the rest after." He helped her to her feet, then onto his horse with a steady hand. Ruth sat in front of him, too tired to protest, as he guided them north across the scrubland. The ranch appeared like a mirage, small but solid, with a stone house and good corrals. A windmill turned lazily in the hot breeze. Daniel helped her down and led her inside to a simple room that felt blessedly cool after the brutal sun. "You rest," he said. "I'll bring food." As he turned to leave, Ruth found her voice. Why are you helping me? He paused in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Because leaving you out there wasn't a choice I could live with. Ruth woke to lamplight and the smell of coffee. She lay on a narrow bed in a room she didn't recognize, a quilt pulled over her despite the heat. Through the doorway, she could see Daniel Ashford moving quietly in the kitchen, setting plates on a worn table. Her hand went instinctively to her belly. The baby shifted beneath her palm, a reassuring flutter. She sat up slowly. Her carpetbag rested against the wall. Daniel must have retrieved it from where she'd dropped it on the road. You're awake. He appeared in the doorway, careful not to enter. How you feeling? Better. It was mostly true. Thank you for. There's stew if you're hungry, he said, cutting off her gratitude like it made him uncomfortable. Nothing fancy. They ate in silence at first, Ruth too famished to speak, Daniel seemingly content with quiet. The stew was simple but good, venison and vegetables, salt and pepper, the kind of meal a man makes when he's used to feeding only himself. Finally Ruth set down her spoon. Mr. Ashford, I meant what I said. I can work. I grew up on a ranch. I know horses, cattle, mending, cooking. You're 7 months along, near as I can tell, he said plainly. Maybe 8. I'm strong. I don't doubt it. He met her eyes across the table. But you collapsed in the heat after walking 2 miles. That tells me you've been pushing too hard already. Ruth looked away. I don't have the luxury of rest. You do now? The words hung in the air between them. Why? She asked quietly. You don't know me. You don't know me anything. Daniel studied his coffee cup. My wife died 4 years back, he said finally. Fever took her fast. I couldn't. There wasn't anything I could do. He looked up. Maybe that's got nothing to do with you. But I saw you out there alone, and walking away wasn't something I could stomach. Ruth felt something crack open in her chest. I'm not your responsibility. Maybe not, he agreed. But you're under my roof now. That makes you my guest. Over the next week, they found a rhythm. Daniel worked the ranch from dawn to dusk, mending fences, tending his small herd, hauling water. Ruth stayed inside at first, obeying his instructions to rest, but idleness had never suited her. By the 3rd day, she was sweeping floors. By the 5th, mending his shirts. By the 7th, she'd reorganized his entire kitchen and started a vegetable garden behind the house. Daniel said nothing, just watched her with something that might have been amusement. You don't listen well, he observed one evening. I don't take charity well, Ruth replied. He almost smiled. I'm noticing that. They talked in fragments, careful exchanges that revealed little. Ruth didn't mention Thomas or her family. Daniel didn't press. But slowly, in the quiet evenings after supper, pieces emerged. She learned he'd built this ranch with his wife, that they'd planned for children who never came, that he'd spent 4 years rattling around this house alone because selling felt like erasing her. He learned Ruth had grown up working cattle, that she could ride better than most men, that she'd never planned on marriage until Thomas Webb made her believe in something that wasn't real. One night, as Ruth washed dishes, Daniel spoke from the doorway. There's talk in town, he said carefully, about a woman staying at my place. Ruth's hands stilled in the water. What kind of talk? The kind that comes when a single man has a guest. He paused. Especially one in your condition. Shame burned through her. I'll leave in the morning. I'm not asking you to leave. His voice was steady. I'm telling you what's being said so you're not blindsided. She turned to face him. Mr. Ashford, I won't damage your reputation. My reputation can handle it, he said. Question is whether yours can. The next Sunday, Daniel drove her to church in town. Ruth felt every eye on her as they entered, saw the whispers behind hands, the cold assessment in women's faces, the calculation in men's. Reverend Cole spoke about charity and judgment. Ruth wondered if anyone was listening. After the service, Martha Hayes approached, a steel-haired woman who ran the general store with an iron fist. Mr. Ashford, she said crisply. A word. Daniel stepped forward, but Martha's gaze was on Ruth. You're the young woman staying at his ranch. Yes, ma'am, Ruth said quietly. Alone. Unmarried. Pregnant. Martha's tone could have cut glass. She needed help, Daniel said. I provided it. You've provided scandal, Martha replied. That child needs a name, Mr. Ashford. And you need a wife before this destroys both of you. The words landed like stones. Ruth's face burned. Mrs. Hayes, Mr. Ashford has shown me nothing but kindness. I won't let. Then marry him, Martha said bluntly. Make it respectable. The silence that followed felt endless. Finally Daniel spoke, his voice carefully neutral. Miss Brennan and I will discuss it. They rode home in silence. That evening, as the sun set over the scrubland, Daniel found Ruth on the porch. I won't trap you, she said before he could speak. I'll leave tomorrow. Find somewhere else. Where? He asked simply. She had no answer. Daniel sat beside her, his weathered hands resting on his knees. I've been thinking about what Martha said. She had no right. She wasn't wrong. He looked at her directly. That baby needs protection. Legally. Socially. And you deserve more than running. Ruth's throat tightened. You're proposing marriage. I'm proposing partnership, he said carefully. A way forward that gives your child a name and you a home. Nothing more than that unless you wanted it to be. Why would you do this? Because I've got land and a house and no one to leave it to, he said. And you've got courage and strength and a child who deserves better than the world's judgment. He stood, giving her space. Think on it. No pressure either way. Ruth sat alone as darkness fell, one hand on her belly, and thought about choices. About Thomas's empty promises and her family's cold rejection. About this quiet man who had found her collapsed under a mesquite tree and hadn't asked for anything except to help. They married 3 days later in Reverend Cole's small church, with Martha Hayes and her husband as witnesses. Ruth wore a simple blue dress. Daniel wore his Sunday clothes and looked uncomfortable in both the suit and the situation. The Reverend kept the ceremony brief, his tone businesslike. When Daniel slipped a plain gold band onto Ruth's finger, his mother's ring, he'd said quietly. She felt the weight of it like a promise she hadn't expected. At the Reverend's instruction, Daniel kissed her cheek, careful and brief. They rode home as husband and wife, though nothing else had changed. That night, Daniel moved his belongings to the small room off the kitchen, giving Ruth the main bedroom without discussion. She tried to protest, but he was already settled, his few possessions arranged with military precision. It's decided, he said, in a tone that didn't invite argument. The weeks that followed were strange and careful. They moved around each other like dancers learning new steps. Breakfast at dawn, work through the day, supper in the evening, quiet conversation before bed. He never pressed for more than she offered. She tried not to take more than she could repay. But slowly something shifted. Ruth began to truly see the ranch, not as temporary shelter, but as home. She planted herbs by the kitchen door, mended the curtains, spent evenings on the porch watching the sunset paint the hills gold. Daniel began to smile more, small expressions that softened the hard lines of his face. He taught her to shoot his rifle, showed her the best grazing land, asked her opinion on which calves to sell. One evening, as Ruth struggled to reach a high shelf, Daniel stepped behind her and lifted down the jar she needed. For a moment they stood close, his hand steadying her elbow, and something passed between them. Awareness, possibility. Ruth stepped back quickly. Thank you. He nodded and left the room. But the moment lingered. The baby came on a cold November night. Daniel rode hard for the midwife, then paced the kitchen while Mrs. Chan worked behind the closed bedroom door. When the baby's cry finally pierced the night, he sank into a chair, his hands shaking. Mrs. Chuan emerged an hour later. A daughter, she said. Both doing well. Daniel stood in the doorway and looked at Ruth, exhausted and radiant, holding a tiny dark-haired infant. She's perfect, Ruth whispered. He crossed the room slowly and looked down at the child. What will you name her? Grace, Ruth said. Then, carefully, Grace Ashford. If that's acceptable. Something broke open in Daniel's expression. It's more than acceptable. He reached out, and Ruth placed the baby in his arms. Daniel held her with surprising ease, this man who'd spent 4 years alone, and Ruth saw tears slip down his weathered face. She's ours, he said quietly. Not a question. A claim. Yes, Ruth whispered. She's ours. Winter settled over the ranch. Daniel built a cradle with his own hands, sanding every edge smooth. Ruth sewed tiny clothes and sang old songs her mother had taught her. Grace grew, her dark eyes taking in the world with solemn curiosity. They were a family, though neither quite knew when the shift had happened. One February evening, as they sat by the fire with Grace sleeping between them, Ruth spoke. I never thank you properly, she said. For everything. Daniel looked up from the harness he was mending. You've thanked me plenty. Not for marrying me, she said. For giving Grace your name. For making us safe, when we had nothing. He set down his work. Ruth, you gave me something too. What could I possibly? Purpose, he said simply. This house was empty before you came. Now it's. He gestured around the room. The mended curtains, the tidy kitchen, the cradle by the fire. It's alive again. Ruth felt her eyes burn. I thought my life was over. My family cast me out. Thomas abandoned me. And I believed I destroyed everything. You survive, Daniel said. That takes more strength than most people ever find. She looked at him across the firelight. This quiet man who'd become her anchor, her partner, her home. When you found me under that tree, she said softly. Why didn't you just take me to town? Leave me at the church? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Because you looked like I felt after Sarah died, he finally said. Lost. Alone. Like the world had used you up and thrown you away. He met her eyes. I couldn't walk past that. Ruth stood and crossed to where he sat. She took his scarred hand in hers. I don't want separate rooms anymore, she said quietly. His breath caught. Ruth, I'm not asking out of obligation, she said. I'm asking because somewhere along the way, this stopped being a business arrangement. She touched his face gently. I want a real marriage, Daniel. If you do. He pulled her close, carefully, like she was something precious. I've wanted that for months, he admitted against her hair. But I didn't want to push. You never push, she said. That's why I love you. The word surprised them both. Daniel pulled back to look at her. You're certain? More certain than I've been about anything, Ruth replied. He kissed her then, gentle and sure, and Ruth felt the last broken pieces of herself begin to mend. Spring returned to the ranch with wildflowers and new calves. Ruth stood on the porch, Grace balanced on her hip, watching Daniel work in the corral. The baby laughed and pointed at her father, and Daniel looked up and waved, his smile wide and unguarded. This was her life now. Not what she'd planned. Not what she'd expected when Thomas Webb made promises he never meant to keep. Something better. A partnership built on honesty. A love that had grown slowly, rooted in respect and care. A daughter who would never doubt she was wanted. That evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, Daniel spoke. I was thinking, he said. Maybe we should expand the herd. Grace is going to need a future. Ruth smiled. Our daughter, he agreed, and kissed her temple. In the distance, the land stretched wide and golden, full of possibility. Ruth Brennan Ashford had been thrown away by her family, abandoned by a man who'd promised forever, and left to collapse alone under a merciless sun. But she'd been found by someone who understood that love wasn't about pretty words or grand gestures. It was about steady hands and quiet strength and choosing, every single day, to build something real. And in the end, that was worth more than all of Thomas Webb's empty promises combined.